We're in the media now.
We are starting 27a, Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, at the Mishnah, 7 lines down from the top. Okay, the Mishnah continues with the chiyuv, the obligation of a person to sit in his sukkah over sukkahs. What exactly is this obligation? So, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Arba esrei sudos chayav adam le'echol b'sukkah. Achas b'yom v'achas b'layla. So Rabbi Eliezer says that a person has the obligation to eat 14 seudos on sukkos in his sukkah. So meaning sukkos lasts for 7 days. Shmini Atzeres counting as its own Yom Tov, so there's no obligation of sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. And this that we sit in a sukkah, or many sit in a sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, the majority of people sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, is only because of what we call Sveika Diyoma. We're unsure, just like in Chutz La'aretz, we always keep 2 days Yom Tov. So then Shmini Atzeres could possibly be the real day of Yom Tov, the last day of Sukkot, and therefore we sit in the sukkah. However, Minat Torah, or in Eretz Yisrael, there's absolutely no a person does not sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. In fact, they are not supposed to. It would be considered adding to the mitzvah, which is Bal Tosif. So Sukkot lasts for 7 days. So therefore, says Rabbi Eliezer, a person is obligated to have 2 seudos every day, which comes out to a total of 14 seudos, on Sukkos. The Chachamim, however, disagree, and they say ein ledavar kitzva. There is no limit, meaning there's no set amount that a person has to eat in the sukkah, meaning that he does not have an obligation to eat in the sukkah every day. The only time he is obligated to make a meal in his sukkah is the first night of Sukkot. Then he's obligated to eat in the sukkah. Other than that, if the person chooses to fast and not have a seudah that day, he is permitted to do so. He's not required. He's not obligated to eat in the sukkah. Now, obviously, if he does make a meal, he's obligated to eat that meal in the sukkah. Okay, what the Mishnah means is that he is able to choose. He's permitted to choose not to have a meal at all. And further, Rabbi Eliezer said, "Mishlo achal leile yom tov harishon, yashlim leile yom tov ha'acharon shel chag." So one who did not eat a seudah in the sukkah on the first night of Sukkot, he can do a make-up meal on the last night of Yom Tov. So meaning Shmini Atzeres, if he has and we'll see what that means exactly, but he eats a special meal Shmini Atzeres night, so that will make up for the fact that he missed the meal the first night of Sukkot. The Chachamim, however, disagree, and they say ein ledavar tashlumin. There's no such a thing as a makeup, and if he missed it, he missed it. Okay, so he missed out on his obligation of a mitzvah. And about this we say, Ma'uvas lo yuchal liskon, v'chesron lo yuchal lihimanos. It's something which is crooked that cannot be straightened. It's something which is lacking that cannot be filled, meaning that the mitzvah was for the first night, and if he misses out on that mitzvah, there's no way to make it up. That's it. He missed out. Okay. Similar to other obligations. For example, there's a mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, right? If a person does not fulfill his obligation of Kriyat Shema, does not recite Kriyat Shema, there's no way to make that up, right? He can't make it up the next day. So similarly here, the Chachamim say that there's an obligation to eat in the sukkah the first night of Sukkot. If a person missed it, if he didn't fulfill that obligation, there's no way to make up for it. Okay. We just finished the Mishnah on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, 27a. We're starting the Gemara. Okay, so the Gemara now wants to explain my taima de Rabbi Eliezer. What is the reasoning behind Rabbi Eliezer that he says a person is obligated to eat 14 meals inside his sukkah over the course of Sukkos? All right, good morning, Jules. We just finished the Mishnah on 27a. We're starting the Gemara 27a. So says the Gemara, Teishvu ke'ein taduru, that he holds the obligation is that the Torah says, "Besukos teishvu," you should reside in the sukkah over the course of the Yom Tov, and a person has to reside in the sukkah just as he would in his house. And since the norm is ma dira achas b'yom v'achas b'layla, just as the norm is for people is to eat 2 meals every day, right? At a minimum, a person eats a meal in the morning, a meal in the evening. So he is just like that's what he would do in his home. Okay, then af sukkah achas b'yom v'achas b'layla. Then so too he's obligated to do that in his sukkah, to eat 2 meals every day in his sukkah. V'Rabbanan, however, the Rabbanan disagree, and they say that to the contrary, the fact that the Torah said teishvu ke'ein taduru, that you should reside in your sukkah just as you would in your house, so that tells me the opposite. Kedira, ma dira ibai achil, ibai lo achil. Just as in your own home, there's no obligation to eat a meal. If a person chooses to skip a meal, right, it's his choice, and he's certainly permitted to do so. Af sukkah nami ibai achil, ibai lo achil. So too, in the sukkah, a person has a choice. If he chooses to eat, then he eats in the sukkah. If he chooses to skip the meal, then he's permitted to make that choice. Now asks the Gemara, Ihachi, afilu leile yom tov rishon nami? Now, if that's the case, that a person can choose to skip a meal, so then why do the Chachamim hold that the first night of Sukkot is an absolute obligation, that the person is required to eat in the Sukkah? We should apply the same logic, and we should say that if he chooses to skip that meal, he's permitted to skip that meal. So what's the distinction? What's the difference between the first night of Yom Tov that the Chachamim say is an obligation versus the rest of Yom Tov where the Chachamim say that it is voluntary? So Amar Rav Yochanan Mishum Rav Shimon ben Yehotzadak. So Rav Yochanan says in the name of Rav Shimon ben Yehotzadak, Ne'emar kan chamisha asar, v'ne'emar chamisha asar b'chag hamatzos. It says the 15th day of the month by Sukkot, and it says the 15th day of the month by Pesach. And this is a famous Gezerah Shava. The Gemara learns out that we apply a connection between Sukkot and Pesach, that the obligation of Sukkot can be learned out from Pesach, and the halachos of Pesach can be learned out from Sukkot. And here we're going to learn out, we're about halfway down the page on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, 27a. So we're right about the middle of the page. So we learn out Sukkot from Pesach. What does that mean? We learn out Sukkot from Pesach. Ma lahalon, laila harishon chova, mikan va'elach reshus. Just as on Pesach, the first night of Pesach, the Seder night, there's an obligation to eat matzah, right? As we know, a person is required to eat matzah at his Seder. However, the rest of Yom Tov, the rest of Pesach, there's no obligation to eat matzah. Meaning, certainly one is forbidden from eating chametz, right? However, let's say he chooses to avoid bread altogether, right? He chooses to avoid bread altogether, and he's only going to eat other foods. He's permitted to do so. There's no obligation for him to go ahead and eat matzah. It's voluntary. So again, the first night is an obligation. The rest of Yom Tov is voluntary. Afkan, so too by Sukkos, we're going to apply the same ruling. Laila harishon chova, mikan va'elach reshus. So the first night of Sukkos is going to be an obligation for him to eat in the Sukkah. The rest of Yom Tov is voluntary, meaning if he's going to eat a meal, then certainly he's obligated to eat that meal in the Sukkah. However, if he chooses to skip a meal, he wants to fast that day, right? So then, or he'll only snack, so then he is permitted to do so outside the Sukkah. He's not required to make a meal in the Sukkah. Now asks the Gemara, how do you know that that's the halacha regarding Pesach? How do you know that on Pesach, the first night is an obligation, however, the rest of Yom Tov is voluntary? Perhaps there's an obligation every day. Ba'erev tochlu matzos hakosov kava'o chova. The Torah says ba'erev tochlu matzos in the evening, meaning the first night of Pesach, a person should eat matzah. So the Torah is clearly stating that the first night is an obligation, and we learn that from there that only the first night is an obligation, and the rest of Yom Tov is voluntary. Okay. Va'od Amar Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara now is going to explain the second statement of Rabbi Eliezer, where he says that if a person misses the meal on the first night of Sukkot, if he does not eat a meal in the Sukkah, the first night of Sukkot, then he can do a make-up meal on the last night of Yom Tov, meaning on Shmini Atzeres. Okay, so the Gemara is going to ask, what in the world does that mean? For Ha'amar Rabbi Eliezer, Arba Esrei Sudos Chayiv Adam Le'achol B'Sukkah. achas b'yom, achas b'layla. But Rabbi Eliezer says that a person has an obligation of eating a meal in the sukkah twice a day for the entire duration of sukkahs, which equals 14 meals, right? So how can it be that he can have a makeup, right? If you say the makeup is during the course of sukkahs, he already has an obligation. And how can Rabbi Eliezer say that he has a makeup for his obligation on Shmini Atzeres? On Shmini Atzeres, he's not going to eat in the sukkah. So the question is obvious, right? How can he have a makeup for missing the meal that he was supposed to eat in the sukkah by eating a meal outside of the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres? So Amar Bira was a sage of the Talmud, was one of the sages at the time of the Gemara. So Bira said, Amar of Ami, in the name of Rav Ami, Chazar bo Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer went back on his statement that he said a person is required to have 14 seudos in the sukkah, and he agrees with the Chachamim now that only the first night is an obligation. However, he disagrees now, and he says that just as there's a concept that there's an obligation for a person to bring a korban when he is Ola Regel. So we know that there's an obligation for every male in Eretz Yisrael to travel to the Beis Hamikdash at the time that there was a Beis Hamikdash. So he's required to travel to the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Tov, and when he does so, he's required to bring a korban. And the halacha is, if a person missed bringing the korban on the first day of Yom Tov, he can make up for that korban on the last day of Yom Tov. So similarly, says Rabbi Eliezer, if a person missed the meal on the first day of Yom Tov, he can make up that obligation on the last day of Yom Tov. Now, says the Gemara, what does that mean that he'll make up for that meal on the last day of Yom Tov? Mashlim b'mai. How does he make up for that meal? What does that mean? Ilema berifta. If it means by eating bread, suda the yomei ka'achil. Right? So he anyways has an obligation of a suda on Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, as a chag, as a holiday, as a Yom Tov, has its own obligation of a meal. Right? So if he's eating a meal, right, it's not a makeup, it's fulfilling his obligation of the day. So what does it mean that he's going to make up for the suda that he missed? So says the Gemara, Ela mai yashlim b'mine targima. So what it means to make up for the meal is to add some special delicacies, whatever it might be. If it's some special baked goods, some special cakes, some special fruit that he doesn't normally have, but kutach, as the Gemara says always, right? So if he's going to add some special food that he doesn't necessarily normally eat at a suda, right? It's a luxury. So if he goes out and adds something that he doesn't normally have, l'chavod Yom Tov, so that counts as his makeup for the missing the meal at the beginning of Yom Tov. Tanya nami hachi, and we learned a proof to this in the Brisa. Im hishlim b'mine targima. If one makes up for his meal by adding in some delicacies, yatsa, then he fulfills his obligation. Okay, so the Gemara now brings a story about this. Shol apotropos shel Agrippas HaMelech, the advisor, one of the important servants, the nobles of Agrippas HaMelech, as Rabbi Eliezer, he asked Rabbi Eliezer, "Kigona ni she'eni ragil lechol ela seuda achas bayom." So I am very busy around the palace, right, and therefore I only have one meal a day. So I eat a large meal, but I normally have only one meal a day. Mahu she'ochel seuda achas ve'poter. So what is the halacha on Sukkos? Meaning he's following the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, right, who said that a person is required to eat 2 meals in the Sukkah every day, right? So he asked Rabbi Eliezer, what about me, right? My custom is only to eat 1 meal. So can I fulfill my obligation by eating a single meal in the Sukkah, or am I required to change my norm and to have 2 meals in the Sukkah every day? Amar lo, so Rabbi Eliezer answered him, on a regular day, although you don't eat 2 meals, right, but along the course of the day, since you're in the king's palace, right, you help yourself to many delicacies. You snack on many special delicacies that are not available to a regular person, and you, for the purpose of your own honor, right? As a sign of being a nobleman, you snack on these delicacies over the course of the day, right? So can you not do the same thing over the course of the day for the honor of your master, for the honor of your creator? Meaning that although you're not going to have a sit-down meal, a full meal, right? You're only going to have one of them. You're not going to have two, but at the very least, you should make sure to have some sort of delicacy over the course of the day, the kavod yom tov, and you should eat that in the sukkah. And he asked him further, Kegon ani, someone like me, sheyesh li shtei nashim, achas b'Tveria v'achas b'Tzipori. So I'm a nobleman. I have two wives, one in the city of Tveria, one in the city of Tzipori. V'yesh li shtei sukkos, and I have two sukkos, two homes, achas b'Tveria v'achas b'Tzipori, one in Tveria, one in Tzipori. Ma'u she'etzei misukkah l'sukkah ve'epater. What is the halacha for me to switch locales, to switch homes in the middle of Yom Tov? So I'll start off Yom Tov in one home, and then I'll complete the Yom Tov in my second home. Am I allowed to switch sukkos in the middle of Yom Tov? So what's the question here? So the question is as follows. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that a person is required to take his residence from his home and switch his residence to his sukkah bikfios for the entire 7 days of Yom Tov, right? As one application of residence, is required to make a kfios of being in that sukkah for 7 days. So being in a single sukkah for the full 7 days. Okay, so the question was as follows: can I switch my residence in the middle of Yom Tov? Okay, now according to the Chachamim, there'd be no problem with this, right? Certainly, a person can switch from one sukkah to the next, right? As we do, right? It's a custom, right? A person is in one sukkah, then he goes to visit somebody else's sukkah, right? He has a party in the third sukkah, right? And he switches. He doesn't eat all his meals in one sukkah, right? And certainly, a person who wants to travel on sukkahs, he can travel and sleep in a different sukkah, a different night. Right? So certainly, according to Chachamim, there's no problem with this. However, the question was according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And in fact, Amar lo, Rabbi Eliezer said, no, you're not permitted to do so. She'ani Omer, because I am of the opinion, I say, Kol hayotze misukkah l'sukkah, batel mitzvasa shel rishona. One who switches his residence from one sukkah to the next in middle of Yom Tov, in middle of Sukkos, right? So then he not only does he not fulfill his obligation for the remainder of the days of Yom Tov, but even the beginning of Yom Tov that he spent in one sukkah, he has not fulfilled his obligation at all, because the requirement of Teishvu Kein Tadura, the requirement of taking your residence in a sukkah, is that you shall remain in that sukkah for the entire 7 days. Again, this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, not the opinion of the Chachamim. Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Eliezer says, going on to Chav Zayin Amud Beis 27b, Ein yotzin misukkah l'sukkah. A person is not permitted to switch his residence from one sukkah to the next. Rashi says whether that means to eat in one sukkah and to sleep in a different sukkah, or to stay in one sukkah on one day and switch to a different sukkah on a different day. A person is not permitted to do so. Ve'ein osin sukkah b'cholo shel moed, and a person is not permitted to build a sukkah on Chol HaMoed. What does that mean? He's not permitted to build a sukkah on Chol HaMoed. It means that the sukkah that he builds has to be a sukkah for all 7 days. Okay? If a person builds a sukkah for 3 days, right, for 4 days, 5 days, he does not fulfill his obligation with that sukkah, right? Because just as Rabbi Eliezer just said, a person is required to take up residence in a sukkah for all 7 days. So if he builds a sukkah for only part of the days of Yom Tov, that sukkah is not valid. A person does not fulfill his obligation in that sukkah. Yes?
Well, I'm going to bet there are exemptions for people who are just a recently redeemed captive or just got out of prison.
So we'll see an exception for someone who was not obligated in mitzvahs. For example, a katan, right, a minor who became his bar mitzvah was during Sukkot, so then he's able to fulfill his obligation. However, for everyone else, Rabbi Eliezer holds not. Okay, one only fulfills his obligation by being in that sukkah for the full 7 days. Again, This is not the opinion of the Chacham, not the opinion that we follow la halacha, as we're going to see right now. The Chachamim disagree, and they say yotzin misukah l'sukkah. A person is permitted to switch from one sukkah to the next. And certainly, a person can, if he did not have a sukkah for the beginning of Yom Tov, he's permitted to build one during Chol HaMoed, and he fulfills his obligation with that sukkah. For Shavin, however, they both agree. She'im nafla shechozer ubona b'chol hashamoed. Let's say he built a sukkah, right? And it lasted for the beginning of Yom Tov, and then, right, there was a storm, right? There was a hurricane, a strong wind, and that was the end of his sukkah, right? And the sukkah came down. So then he is permitted to rebuild that sukkah on Chol HaMoed. What does that mean? It's permitted to rebuild that sukkah on Chol HaMoed, meaning even Rabbi Eliezer will agree that that sukkah is valid for the remainder of Yom Tov. We don't say that when he's building a sukkah now, it's only a sukkah for 5 days, and it's not a valid sukkah. No, in that case, Rabbi Eliezer will agree that since he had the sukkah standing for the beginning of Yom Tov, so then that sukkah will be valid if he has to rebuild it during Yom Tov. My time at Rabbi Eliezer, what's the reasoning behind Rabbi Eliezer that he holds that one does not fulfill his obligation with the sukkah that he builds during Chol HaMoed? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Chag HaSukkos ta'asa l'cha shivas yamim. One has to make a sukkah for himself for 7 days. What does that mean? Asay sukkah hara'uya l'shiva. He has to have a sukkah in order to fulfill his obligation. The sukkah itself has to be built for 7 days. Right? So the sukkah itself has to be built for 7 days. A sukkah which is not built for 7 days, meaning that it was built in the middle of Yom Tov, such a sukkah is not valid at all. So the sukkah itself is invalid, and one does not fulfill his obligation with that sukkah. For Rabbanan, how do the Chachamim interpret the pasuk? Hachika amar achmana. This is what the Torah means to say. Asay sukkah b'chag. It means to the contrary. Chag HaSukkos ta'asa l'cha shivas yamim. Any time during the 7 days, you should build yourself a sukkah. Meaning, it's teaching me that even during the course of Yom Tov, obviously not on the first day of Yom Tov when it's a person is forbidden from doing malacha, but on Chol HaMoed, a person can build himself a sukkah, and that sukkah is valid. The Shavin, and however they both agree, she'im nafla shechozer bona osa b'chol hashamoed, that if it fell down, a person can put it back up, can rebuild it on Chol HaMoed. Says the Gemara pshita. That should be obvious. No, I might have thought, I might have thought that no, right? According to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, right? Although the sukkah was standing for the first day of Yom Tov, right? If subsequently, following that it fell down, right? So then, if he's rebuilding it, what does it mean rebuilding? Right? It's a new sukkah. Right? It's a brand new sukkah. Just because the sukkah was standing for the beginning of Yom Tov, if it fell down, now he's building a new sukkah. That's what I might have thought. Kamash Malan. So therefore, it has to teach me. The Brisa is teaching me that no, even Rabbi Eliezer will agree that since this sukkah itself was standing and then it fell down, right? If he rebuilds it, that's considered the very same sukkah that he had earlier, right? And it's considered a sukkah for all 7 days, and it would be a valid sukkah. Okay. Tanya, we learned further in the Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer says, Kishem she'ein adam yotzech yidei chovaso, b'yom tov harishon shel chag, b'lulvo shel chavero. Just as the halacha is that a person cannot fulfill his obligation of dalin minim, his obligation of taking lulav and esrog, on the first day of Yom Tov, a person cannot fulfill that obligation by borrowing his friend's lulav and esrog. Okay, a person cannot fulfill his obligation by using somebody else's lulav and esrog. He's required to have his own. He has to have ownership of it. How do we know that? Because the pasuk says, "Ulekachtem lochem b'yom harishon." You shall take for yourself on the first day of Sukkos prietz hadar kapos tamarim, a special food referring to the esrog kapos tamarim. Right. So the lulav, a person is required to have his own mishalochem. That it has to be his own. He has to have ownership of it, right? And he does not fulfill his obligation by borrowing somebody else's lulav and esrog. Kach Ein adam yotze de chovaso b'sukaso shel chavero. So too, he cannot fulfill his obligation by sitting in somebody else's sukkah. The sukkah must belong to him. How do we know that? That you shall make a sukkah for yourself for 7 days. So the Torah says lecha, mishel lecha, that it has to belong to you. So according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, a person can only fulfill his obligation by building a sukkah for himself, right, and sitting in his own sukkah on Sukkos. Okay. However, the Chachamim don't get worried. The Chachamim disagree. Although we agree that regarding Daled Minim, regarding Lulav and Esrog, a person cannot fulfill his obligation with somebody else's Lulav and Esrog. That is, in fact, the halacha. A person is required to buy one for himself. He has to have ownership of his Lulav and Esrog. It has to be his own in order for him to fulfill the obligation on the first day of Yom Tov. However, the sukkah is different. He can fulfill his obligation with a sukkah belonging to somebody else, right? So he can borrow his friend's sukkah, he can sit in his friend's sukkah, he can be a guest by somebody else, and he fulfills his obligation even by sitting in the sukkah that belongs to somebody else. How do we know that? So how do we know that there's a distinction between the two? Rabbi Eliezer seems to have a good point. Right? The Torah says lecha, right, by Daled Minim, and that teaches us that it has to be yours, right? And it uses the same word lecha regarding sukkah. So how do we know to draw a distinction between the two? How do we know that for Daled Minim it has to be yours, but for sukkah you can fulfill your obligation with somebody else's? Because the pasuk says Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshvu basukos. Any member of Klal Yisrael, any citizen of Klal Yisrael shall sit, all the citizens of Klal Yisrael, shall sit in a sukkah. Malamed, that teaches me shekol Yisrael re'uyim leishe b'sukkah achas, that all of Klal Yisrael can fulfill their obligation with a single sukkah. Now, what does that mean? Right? So Rashi explains, okay, that if all of Klal Yisrael is fulfilling their obligation with a single sukkah, right, it's impossible that each person has ownership of that sukkah. Meaning, you might tell me as follows. You might tell me perhaps they're partners, right? And if a person is a partner, right, so then he has ownership of the sukkah. And even Rabbi Eliezer would agree that that's valid. Okay? Even Rabbi Eliezer would agree that if I'm a partner, so then I have ownership, I could fulfill my obligation. But Rashi says that can't be the case. It's impossible. Okay? In order for me to be a partner, right, I have to have ownership. In order for me to have ownership, there has to be a monetary ownership of that sukkah, meaning at the very least, I have to have a share, right? A valuable share of that sukkah. What would be a valuable share? At the very least, a shaveh pruta, right? The minimum amount of ownership, something which has monetary value, is a pruta, right? Which is a very small amount. Bisman hazeh, we apply it to about 5 cents, 5 to 10 cents. So a person at the very least has to have a share that's worth 5 to 10 cents. Now, if you have a sukkah, right, no matter how valuable that sukkah might be, right, it's impossible that all of Klal Yisrael, right, can have a 5 to 10 cent share in that sukkah, right? There's way too many people, right, for each person to have a monetary share, a 5 to 10 cent share in that sukkah. Yeah, exactly. Right. Right. Nowadays, right, given how expensive the schach is, right, maybe, but at least in the time of the Gemara, right, it would be impossible for everybody to have a 5 to 10 cent share in that sukkah, right?
Right. I'm sorry, I lost my place. Could you please tell me the first word of the line that we're on?
Milamed, about halfway down. Shekol Yisrael, yes, okay. About halfway down. So. If it's impossible for each person to have a full share, a monetary share in the sukkah, right? So then what are we saying? In effect, they're borrowing from each other, right? Each person fulfills his obligation, right? Not so much borrowing, but they're fulfilling their obligation of sukkah, right? Without ownership of that sukkah, right? So that means, that teaches us that one can fulfill his obligation, right, without actual ownership of the sukkah, which means that it's not required to be yours, right? So too a person can fulfill his obligation by sitting in somebody else's sukkah. Okay, so again, Malamed is teaching us Shekol Yisrael v'uyim leishe b'sukkah achas. All of Klal Yisrael can fulfill their obligation with a single sukkah, right? And Rashi explains what that means is that each person, as they come into the sukkah, right? So obviously, we're not going to put all of Klal Yisrael into a single sukkah at the same time, right? Things will get a little crowded. So what it means is they'll take turns, and each person, as he enters the sukkah, can take ownership of the sukkah and then pass on that ownership to the next person, even though that would not be valid for a lulav and esrog, for daled minim, but it would be valid for sukkah. So now, if that's the case, right, according to the Chachamim, why did the Torah say lecha? Why did the Torah say it has to be yours? If in fact you're permitted to, you can fulfill your obligation with somebody else's sukkah. So it doesn't have to be yours. Right, so why did the Torah say lecha, that it should be yours? It's not true. Okay, so answers the Gemara. So miboyele lemute gezula. So no, the Torah is teaching me that although I can be yotze with borrowing somebody's sukkah, but I cannot be yotze by stealing somebody else's sukkah. What does that mean by stealing somebody else's sukkah? Right. So if I walk into somebody else's sukkah, right, I boot him out of there. Right, and I now sit down and eat my meal in the sukkah without his permission, so then I would not fulfill my obligation. I will she'ula, but if it comes to borrowing the sukkah with his permission, ksiv kol ezrach, so then that this pasuk of saying all the citizens of Klal Yisrael can be fulfill their obligation with a single sukkah, that teaches me that a borrowed sukkah is valid. For Rabbi Eliezer, now if that's the case, hay kol ezrach, according to Rabbi Eliezer, hay kol ezrach my avid. What does Rabbi Eliezer do with this pasuk that says that all the citizens of Klal Yisrael can fulfill their obligation with the sukkah, right? Doesn't that seem to indicate that you do not need ownership? So answers the Gemara, mi boyele leger shen is gayer bein tayim, v'koton shen is gadol bein tayim. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer says that it's coming to teach me that let's say you have a convert who converts in the middle of Sukkot, right? He converts in the middle of Sukkot. So he did not have an obligation of sukkah for the beginning of the Yom Tov. Now his obligation begins in the middle of Yom Tov. Or you have a minor, you have a katan who reaches bar mitzvah, he reaches gadlus, he now becomes an adult in the middle of Sukkot. So now he has an obligation that begins then. Okay? So then says Rabbi Eliezer that the Torah is teaching me that such a person can fulfill his obligation by sitting in a sukkah for the remainder of Yom Tov. Why would I think not? Because remember, we just said earlier that Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion, right, that one can only fulfill his obligation by staying in the same sukkah for 7 days. He has to have a sukkah built for the entire 7 days, and he has to stay in the same sukkah for all 7 days. So I might have thought, right, that somebody whose obligation only begins in the middle of Yom Tov, so he only has an obligation for 5 days or whatever it might be, right? So then perhaps he cannot fulfill his obligation at all. Perhaps he's completely precluded from fulfilling his obligation of the mitzvah, right? He's stuck. There's nothing he can do. So therefore, the Torah teaches me that no, kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael, any citizen of Klal Yisrael, which is coming to include, it's coming to add even somebody who becomes a member of Klal Yisrael during Sukkot itself, he can fulfill his obligation of Sukkah by sitting in that Sukkah for the remainder of the Yom Tov. V'Rabbanan. And according to the Chachamim, how do they know that that's true? Somebody who becomes a member of Klal Yisrael in the middle of Sukkot, that he can fulfill his obligation. So says the Gemara, according to the Rabbanan, it was never a question. Since the Rabbanan anyways are of the opinion that a person can switch sukkahs in the middle of Yom Tov, right? He's permitted to travel from one sukkah to the next in the middle of Yom Tov, right? And he's permitted to build a sukkah which will only last for 5 days of Yom Tov, right? Or similarly, 5 days, 6 days, whatever it might be of Yom Tov, right? So of course, it's obvious that somebody who becomes a member of Klal Yisrael in the middle of Yom Tov, of course, he can fulfill his obligation for the rest of Yom Tov. I don't even need a pasuk to teach me that. Okay, Tanu Rabbana. Okay, we learned a story. Maaseh b'Rab Eloi. There was a story with Rabbi Eloi. Shaholach lahakbil pnei Rabbi Eliezer Rabo belud beregel. So he traveled on Yom Tov, on the Yom Tov of Sukkot, to visit his Rebbe, Rabbi Eliezer, during Yom Tov itself, he traveled to the city of Lud, which that's where Rabbi Eliezer lived on Yom Tov. Omar Lo, so Rabbi Eliezer said to him when he arrived, Ilai, eincha mishovse haregel. Okay, you are not fulfilling your obligation of resting, of enjoying, of enjoying Yom Tov, of Simchas Yom Tov by resting over Yom Tov. Meaning, what does that mean? That you should have stayed home with your wife and family over Yom Tov, because that's how a person fulfills his obligation of Simchas Yom Tov. Shahaya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, because Rabbi Eliezer used to say, "Mishabeach ani es ha'atzlanin." Okay, I praise those who are lazy. Right? What does that mean? They're lazy. She'enan yotzin mibatehen baregel. They do not leave their homes on the Yom Tov. I mean, they don't travel on the Yom Tov. They stay with their families over Yom Tov. Right? So seemingly they're lazy. Right? But here it's not derogatory. Rather, what we mean to say is that it's praiseworthy that they stay in their home with their families over Yom Tov. Because the pasuk says, "V'samachta ata ubesecha," that you shall rejoice, you and your home, meaning referring to your family, your wife and family. So, in order to fulfill the obligation of rejoicing, of celebrating on Yom Tov, a person has to remain with their family. So, therefore, he was admonishing Rabbi Loi that you should not have traveled to me on Yom Tov, because by doing so, you're not fulfilling your obligation of rejoicing on Yom Tov. Says the Gemara, yeah.
There was the obligation
to go to the temple, and generally people used to bring their families with them to Yerushalayim, right? But there's also an obligation, as the Gemara is going to ask, for a person to visit his Rebbe on Yom Tov, right? So how do you explain the two? So how do you reconcile the two? And that's the Gemara's question. Eini, it can't be. Va'amar Rav Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak himself said, Minayin shechayev adam lahakbil pnei rabo beregel. Right, a person is obligated to visit his Rebbe on Yom Tov. Right, so how do we reconcile the two? How do we say he's obligated to stay home, and at the same time he's obligated to visit his Rebbe? Now, how do we know that in fact there's such an obligation? Shene'emar madua at holeches elav hayom lo chodesh v'lo Shabbos. So this is the story of the Shunamis, right? So the woman who was blessed to have a child by Elisha Hanavi, and then it's a famous haftorah, right? He would bless this woman to have a child. She was childless for many years. He blessed her to have a child, and then that child subsequently died, right? And the woman then immediately travels to Elisha, right, to inform him that the child is this child that you gave me, right? This child that you gave me died, right? What type of gift did you give me, right? You gave me this gift and then you took it away from me, right? And Elisha immediately travels and he resuscitates this child, right? This is the Haftorah that Elisha was given the power to resuscitate the dead, and he brought the child back to life, right? But in the story itself, the woman does not want to inform her husband that the child has died, right? Because the less people who knew about it, the smaller the miracle itself, right? Because the fewer people who knew about it, the less publicity the miracle will have. And in general, we try and minimize the publicity of a miracle. And therefore, she didn't inform anybody that the child had died. So she says to her husband, I'm going to visit the Navi. I'm traveling to Elisha to visit the Navi, the prophet Elisha. And her husband says to her, right, why are you traveling to visit the Navi on a regular day, right? A regular weekday, you're traveling to visit the Navi. It's not Shabbos. It's not Rosh Chodesh, right? It's not a holiday, right? Now, and she says, don't ask too many questions. I'm going, right? And she goes, right? But the point is that he says to her, right? It's not a holiday. Meaning, had it been a holiday, right? He would have understood why she's going. He would have been okay with her going, right? What does that teach us? That in fact there's an obligation for a person to visit his Rebbe, right? To visit a great Torah scholar, right? A Navi, a prophet on a holiday, right? So Michlal, we see from the story the Bechodesh v'Shabbos on a holiday mechayev inish la'agabule ape rabbe, that a person is required to go and visit a great Torah scholar, to visit his Rebbe, or to visit a great Torah scholar, a Navi, on a holiday, right? So we see that there's such an obligation. So how do we reconcile the two? How do we say that he's obligated to stay home, right? And at the same time, he's obligated to visit his Rebbe. Says the Gemara, lo kashya, it's not a question. When is he obligated to go visit his Rebbe? If his Rebbe lives in the same town, right, or in a close by town where he's able to travel and come back on the same day. So he'll travel there during the daytime, he'll visit his Rebbe, and by nightfall he'll be back. So he'll spend the night with his wife and family, right? So then he is fulfilling his obligation of rejoicing, and he's also fulfilling his obligation of visiting his Rebbe. However, to travel and to travel overnight, so he's not going to be home with his wife and family, then he should not do so because he's not fulfilling his obligation of rejoicing on Yom Tov. Tanu Rabbanan, we learn further. Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer sheshavas beGolil ha'elyon b'sukaso shel Yochanan b'Rabbi Eloi b'Kesari. So Rabbi Eliezer once spent the holidays, spent Sukkos, or at least right now we're assuming that it was Sukkos. He spent Sukkos in the Sukkah of Yochanan b'Rabbi Eloi b'Kesari, in the Caesarea of Amrila b'Kesarion. Some say it was a different city known as Kesarion. And while they were sitting in the Sukkah, the sun, right, began to shine into the Sukkah, and it became uncomfortable, right? It became uncomfortably hot in the Sukkah. Amar lo, so Yochanan said to him, Ma'u she'efros aleha sadin. So what is the halacha? Am I permitted to place a sheet, a curtain over the schach, over the roof of the Sukkah, right? Is that permitted on Yom Tov? And Rashi explains the question was: is that considered constructing a building? Is that considered constructing an ohel, a tent, on Shabbat or Yom Tov, right, which is forbidden, right? So although there's already a structure here, right? There's already a structure of this of the sukkah, right? But now I'm adding something. I'm adding an additional material to that structure. Is that permitted to do on Shabbos or Yom Tov? And am I permitted to do that? So Amar lo, so Rabbi Eliezer did not answer him. Rather, he said to him, "Ein lecha kol shevet v'shevet mi Yisrael shelo ha'emid mimenu shofet." So he changed the topic, right? He completely changed the topic, and he said to him, "You should know that there's not a single shevet, not a single tribe in Klal Yisrael that did not have a shofet, a judge, a leader who came from that shofet, who came from that tribe." Okay, so Yochanan dropped the subject, right? However, then later the sun, as the sun was rising through the sky, right, the sunlight spread to half of the sukkah already, right? So it became increasingly uncomfortable. So Amar lo ma'u she'efros aleha sadin. So he asked him again, "Am I permitted to put up a sheet to block the sun?" Amar lo ein lecha kol shevet v'shevet mi Yisrael shelo yatzu mimenu neviim. Okay. There was not a single tribe that did not have a prophet that came from that tribe. Shevet Yehuda Binyamin ha'emidu malachim al pi neviim, and from Shevet Yehuda and Binyamin, they crowned kings based on the prophets. Okay, so again, he changed the subject. He refused to answer him. So the sun came to the feet of Rabbi Eliezer. It already began to shine on Rabbi Eliezer himself. Natal Yochanan Sadin Upiras Aleha. So Yochanan gave up on getting an answer from Rabbi Eliezer, and he decided to just go ahead and do so. So he spread the sheet over the schach to block the sun. Hifshil Rabbi Eliezer taliso la'achorov v'yatza. And Rabbi Eliezer, he put on his talis, his cloak, and he left the sukkah. Why did he do so? Because by sitting in the sukkah, right, with this sheet there, he would automatically be giving his approbation, he'd be giving his okay, right, for doing so, right, for spreading the sheet over the sukkah on Yom Tov, right? So he did not want to give his okay, did not want to give to be seen as ruling that it's permitted to do so. So he left the sukkah. Okay. Now the Gemara explains, not because Rabbi Eliezer was simply trying to distract Yochanan, and he did not want to give him an answer. Rather, because the halacha ela mipnei shelo amar davar shelo shama mipi rabo leolam. So rather, because Rabbi Eliezer, as we'll see further in the next amud, on the next page, Rabbi Eliezer was very careful, okay, never to state a halacha that he did not learn directly from his Rebbe. Okay, he refused to apply his own rulings, okay, to apply his own logic, and he only taught the Torah that he had learned directly from his Rebbe. Now, since he had not received a direct Masorah, a direct tradition from his Rebbe regarding the halacha of spreading a sheet over the sukkah, he didn't want to give a ruling over it, right? So therefore, he refused to give such a ruling, right? He refused to give his permission, to give his approbation to it, and therefore, when Yochanan did so, he left the sukkah rather than give his approbation for it. And the Gemara is now going to question, how could Rabbi Eliezer leave the sukkah and go to a different sukkah? Right? Rabbi Eliezer himself was of the opinion, like we just stated earlier, that one has to stay in a single sukkah for the entire Yom Tov. So how could he have left the sukkah and traveled to a different one? Right? According to Rabbi Eliezer himself, he does not fulfill his obligation in such a case. So we'll see that question tomorrow, right? Of how Rabbi Eliezer could do so. Okay. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful day.